Way of Hyderabad. On behalf of United Way of Hyderabad, I welcome you to today's interactive session with Dr. Bhaskar Chatterjee to learn and deepen our understanding of the recent amendments to the CSR rules. Before we go into the session, let me provide you a brief overview of the United Way network and United Way of Hyderabad in particular. United Way Worldwide is the largest international non-profit established about 135 years ago, and today there are 1,800 United Way chapters in 40 plus countries worldwide. United Way India has been actively working in the country since 1986, and today there are 8 chapters in the country. The Hyderabad chapter was conceptualized and brought to light 10 years back. United Way of Hyderabad manages multi-stakeholder collaborations to create larger collective impact. The operating model of UWH is to collaborate with corporates, grassroots organizations, the government, and thought leaders in the sector for maximized impact in the communities. Well, there are several ways through which United Way of Hyderabad can support the corporate partners. UWH can collaborate on volunteer engagement, employee payroll giving, disaster management, single partnership for multiple engagements, CSR management, CSR Stakeholder Connect, which promotes thought leadership and sectoral discussions. So specific to CSR management, how does United Way of Hyderabad add value? UWH adds value by supporting the entire life cycle of a CSR project through designing and implementing projects, including seeking government approvals, proposal writing, conducting legal, financial, and programmatic due diligence of project partners, detailed monitoring and evaluation of the project, including periodic visits to project sites and tracking impact metrics, facilitating project visits of leadership to project sites, volunteer engagement with beneficiaries, and also reporting in compliance with Ministry of Corporate Affairs and also issuing ATG receipts for contributions. So what does United Way of Hyderabad focus on? It focuses on education, healthcare, livelihoods, care and protection, and the very important environment. To date, UWH has 65 corporate partners, 132 NGO partners, has mobilized 170 crores of funds so far, supports 60% of the government schools in Hyderabad, and most importantly, has positively impacted 14,50,000 plus lives so far. So ladies and gentlemen, what is today's session about? All of you are aware that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has amended the company's CSR Policy Rules of 2014 through a notification dated 22nd of Jan this year. Now, this amendment would come into immediate effect, which includes CSR reporting for the financial year 2021. And some of the highlights of the amendment rules include the definitions have changed, a shift from directional to mandatory CSR, increased rigor on internal control, increased emphasis on transparency, and a much greater stress on impact creation, and many more. However, with the possible multiple interpretations of the rules, it is absolutely pertinent for corporates and implementing agencies to have a much deeper understanding. Today's session, ladies and gentlemen, will focus on the implications for corporates and will demystify the rules for an effective program implementation and compliance to MCA. To talk about this, we are indeed privileged to have with us an eminent personality who is widely regarded as the father of corporate social responsibility in India, Dr. Bhaskar Chatterjee. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee was instrumental in framing and issuing the CSR guidelines for public sector enterprises in April 2010. Thereafter, He played a major role in the inclusion of Section 135 in the Companies Act of 2013 and in the framing of rules thereafter. As the Director General and CEO of the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, he spearheaded the National Foundation for Corporate Social Responsibility. He has spoken and lectured on the subject of CSR at a very large number of national and international fora over the last 5 years and is acknowledged as the primary force for bringing a new paradigm to the realm of CSR and providing it with an innovative and strategic vision. Dr. Chatterjee is also a widely acclaimed management practitioner, theorist, and teacher. He has written and lectured over many years on issues of social and sustainable development, corporate responsibility, and human resources. Dr. Chatterjee has most recently authored his latest book entitled Sustainable Futures, Imperatives for Managing the Social Agenda. In this book, Dr. Chatterjee shows how governments, corporates, and civil society organizations can synergize their efforts to build a whole new paradigm of development that is sustainable, humanistic, and inclusive. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chatterjee will provide his views and thoughts for the next 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A for 45 minutes. Please do send in your questions in the Q&A tab that you can see on the screen, as I strongly believe that there will be no greater opportunity than this for us to interact with the father of corporate social responsibility in India. Dr. Chatterjee, many, many thanks for joining us today. Over to you, sir.
Wonderful introduction. It is indeed a privilege and a pleasure to be with all you viewers here today. And big thanks to United Way Hyderabad for giving me this opportunity. Let me then, without further ado, move to the first slide in the presentation, which is titled Background and Objectives. Yes, so just a very broad overview. Many of you, of course, are familiar with the background. Let's understand one thing. We framed the law in 2013, and then, of course, it became operational from the 1st of April 2014. From that day to this, the law itself has undergone change only once, and that was the July 31st notification of 2019, very minor change. But otherwise, the law specifically has remained unchanged. It is the rules which have been changed from time to time for purposes of updation and clarity. And this one, which has now happened on January 22nd, 2021, is in fact the most comprehensive set of changes. The most comprehensive one being the rules themselves. So these changes are something that were long overdue, in the sense that a lot of clarity was required. The practice over these last 7 years have thrown up many issues, and this was an attempt by the ministry to finally provide a closure to some of the doubts, difficulties, and queries that people had. Just a quick glimpse, you have about 80,000 crores having been spent cumulatively. And of course, the nation has a right to ask, where did this money go? How was it utilized? Was it used well or not? And therefore, one of the things we've also looked at is the ease of doing business and decriminalizing. A lot of the corporates initially were not very happy with the fact that if you didn't comply, you could actually be incarcerated. So that fear has now been taken away. We are moving into a penalty regime rather than an imprisonment regime. Cost transparency, disclosure also stepped up considerably. And the idea is to look at outputs rather than, just processes. And so the outcomes now become important. Outputs were just processes. So given this background, we can now try and look at some of the specific things that have been done in this set of amendments. Next slide, please. So yes, one thing, I think Mamta also said this in the beginning, it is immediately effective. So prospectively, of course, not retrospectively, but the returns and things like that which now need to be done will be effective from this very year, this very financial year itself. And of course, there are some specific rules which have specific dates, and those of course stand in a different category, but otherwise the effectiveness of these amendments begin with 22nd of January 2021. What they bring in also is something that we will take up in the next slide. So let's understand that now this makes it mandatory. The era of, we might comply or explain, we might put in something here or thing there. That era of CSR is now extinct. Pretty much the onus of compliance and doing CSR strategically under the rules and under the Section 135 has begun. The mandatory era in India has begun. Next, please. First things first. We're looking at it from the corporate point of view, and this is important for corporates to know, but equally for implementing agencies, this becomes vital. So when you are engaging an implementing agency, you need to know what kind of implementing agency can you now engage for carrying out your CSR activities. Even if you are a foundation, these apply to you. If you are a foundation which sublets or outsources to other implementing agencies, this also applies to you. And therefore, this form, the CSR 1 form, in which you need to fill up and register yourselves by April 1st of 2021, is now necessary. And therefore, 12A ATG also come into play. When you submit this electronically, you will have a CSR registration number that will be generated. And in all the MOUs that you sign, you need to quote this registration number. So engagement between corporates and between implementing agencies now necessitates that the implementing agency has a valid CSR registration number. Of course, the CSR Form 1 is a one-pager, yet you cannot fill it if you don't have what it asks for. I mean, the site itself won't register you. So make sure that you have all the details and make sure that you file before the 1st of April 2021. Next, please. The first point I've already mentioned here, electronically CSR 1 form needs to be filled. Now, what's the purpose of all this? The purpose of all this is to ensure that the implementing agencies are really and truly valid ones, ones which have declared transparently their basic data, ensuring that it is also possible now to make a national list of implementing agencies, and the MCA, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, will probably bring it out in their portal. So at any point of time, if anyone, whether a researcher or a data collector or somebody interested in CSR, wants to know how many implementing agencies, where are they operating, what are their numbers, they can go to the site and find out. We also have now public trust registered societies, and therefore a fairly large number of entities now can take up CSR work for corporates. Next, please. All right. These are the three things, but I would draw your attention to the second line in this slide, which says that the CSR activities can be undertaken by the company itself, which means that the company can directly also take up CSR activities. We know that corporations like Reliance, some parts of Mahindra employ a huge army of CSR staff. And much of this CSR staff is engaged in conducting CSR activities directly. It's the most expensive. I don't know if it's also the most practical way of doing CSR, but that's what they do. But such companies can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Very few ever even attempt this. For those who cannot afford it, don't want to do it, then you have these three categories of implementing agencies: Section 8 companies, registered public trusts, registered societies, and you can take up this work either singly or along with any other company and engage with entities that are established by central government or state government. But it is important to remember that such organizations, the three square ones that you see there, they should have a track record of at least 3 years of undertaking CSR work. Once you have that, then you can go ahead and then once they are registered, you can engage them in conducting CSR activities. Next, please. Now, there were a few important queries as to definitions, and many corporates and many NGOs wanted to know what does a particular word mean, what is the context, what does it imply, and some of these definitional changes that we see in Rule 2, they have now found a clear spelling out of what it means. So when we talk about administrative overheads, this was not there before, and it relates to general management and administration of the CSR functions in the company, and of course excludes these like designing, implementation, monitoring, evaluation. These are all part of project costs. So very clearly now, remember that, and we'll come to that, 5% will be applicable, and you can use this for the administrative overheads within the company. And administrative overheads are the kind of monies that you use to run the CSR vertical of the company. So salaries, office equipment, electricity bills, whatever else you need to pay, but it must be limited to 5%. Now remember one thing very categorically. This 5% applies only to corporates, not to implementing agencies. Therefore, when you sign an MOU with an implementing agency, their admin costs may be 10%, 15%, 20%. Whatever works between you and the implementing agency, you have to give them sustenance in order that they should carry out good projects. So this 5% is for the company only, not for implementing agencies. Also, this time, and of course it was there before, but now fleshed out more clearly, is what are the activities that you cannot count for CSR? And there are these specific 6 categories. Normal course of business, with this exception of COVID. What does normal course of business mean? Let me give you an example. Suppose you are the Rural Electrification Corporation of India, and you connect a rural house to the nearest substation and provide electricity to that rural house. You may say, now look, this is rural development, and therefore it is CSR. And Rural Electrification Corporation lists this activity as a CSR activity. Would that be valid? And this answers categorically that it would not be valid because Rural Electrification Corporation has a clear mandate to connect rural houses with electricity. So anything that is in the normal course of your business would not count, except of course now the exception made for COVID-19. Activities benefiting employees, so no HR stuff here. Activities undertaken outside India, except for coaching Indian sports persons. Any funding to political parties, Sponsorships, such as if you were, let's say, sponsoring the cricket match at Motera, it would not count towards your CSR activities. And this is important, fulfillment of obligations under laws in force. Example, your factory, your production unit is discharging polluted water into a nearby river. You receive a notice from the Pollution Control Board which says that you need to purify this water before you let it out. And you then install a water purification plant in your factory. The cost of this water purification plant will not count towards CSR because you are fulfilling a specific law or regulation. So it has to be something that is not in compliance with any other law. So the idea here is to move to a regime of strategic CSR and to go beyond, just writing checks or what you call, just pure philanthropy. Right. Next, please. Now we come to this part, CSR policy, ongoing projects, unspent amount. This is important, very, very important, because we must understand this very clearly. Let's take the first one first, CSR policy. What was it? What we saw in these last 7 years is people drew up a fairly sketchy policy, which then remained pretty much untouched year to year. It lay on a shelf, that was the policy, it was there on the website, and then promptly forgotten. Now that kind of frozen CSR policy is now a thing of the past, needs to be a thing of the past. The CSR committee, and slides after this will elaborate it further, is now tasked with ensuring that the policy is actually consisting also of an annual action plan. You need to look at the CSR policy clearly spelling out the projects that are going to be taken up in the following financial year. What are the modalities that will be adopted for implementation, for monitoring, for evaluation? All that has to be spelled out very clearly. In short, the policy has to be a very, very important document. Of course, it must also be placed on your website so that it is there in the public domain, which means that the CSR committee has to really work hard, and then that CSR policy does not become the policy of the company until it is passed by the board in a specific resolution. Let's move to number 2, ongoing projects. What does ongoing projects mean? This is now defined under Rule 211. So these are multi-year projects. I have said here, although it's not specifically stated in the rules, that multi-year projects should generally stretch to 1+3. Don't try to go beyond that because we're not still clear as to what will happen beyond a 4-year span. So as far as possible, multi-year projects should be 3-year projects. You can include the first year itself, the starting year. So it could be 4 years, but try and avoid going over 4 years. And then if you have, let us say, a project whose initial duration was 1 year, but you feel is doing well, has gained traction, beneficiaries are excited about it, and you want to extend that by another year, then the board has been given the power to extend that based on reasonable assumptions. Unspent amount. Now, as I speak to you, note down 3 words which are important for us. And they are unspent, excess, surplus. You must remember that the CSR law at heart is a spending law. Therefore, how much you spend is in fact the very heart of the law. And the 3 terms that are used here separately are these. unspent, excess, surplus. And they are very, very distinct and very, very different. And every single CSR practitioner worth his salt should understand that distinction very clearly. I will, of course, spell that out as I go further in these. So now let's look at unspent. In the unspent part, remember that there are two categories. What are these two categories? One that remains unspent at the end of a particular year of the project or at the completion of the project. And these are unspent amounts. What should you do with this unspent amount? You need to put this into a separate account. Next slide, we will come to that. What kind of separate amount? What would be the name of that account? By when would you need to put your unspent amount in that special account? We will tell you. The second category of unspent amount is that which remains unspent even after being put in that special account. So let's say your project was worth 1 crore over a period of 2 years. At the end of 2 years, you spent 90 lakhs, 10 lakhs remained unspent. You put that 10 lakhs into this special account. And when you put it there, these 10 lakhs in that special account, you're given 3 more years to spend it. 3 more years pass and you still do not spend the 10 lakhs. Or let's say you spend only 5 lakhs of the 10 lakhs. Then this becomes the second category of unspent. Now your control over those funds ceases. That now moves to any of the funds under Schedule 7, which exists, such as the Prime Minister's Relief Fund, funds for scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, whatever funds are created that's there in Schedule 7. You will have to move these funds into one of those. Your control over those funds ceases. So you need to analyze your unspent amounts very, very carefully. That's why I advised you, stay within a 3-year period, always safe, easier to monitor, and then of course look after the compliances. Next, please. And that's why my next slide is in fact called Analysis of Unspent Amount. And I mentioned to you, please ensure that you divide them into 2 distinct categories. Very carefully look at the financial results on the CSR side of what you've done with the projects. What is the first category of unspent, which means that which you can have another 3 years to spend, and the second category which now you no longer have control of. So make sure that this is done. And of course, the timelines are given in this very slide, 30 days from the end of the financial year. And of course, if you want to send it across to the National Unspent Fund, hasn't been made yet. That may or may not actually happen. But in place of this National Unspent Fund, you can transfer it to one of the funds in the Schedule 7, and you can do this within 6 months of the end of the financial year. So this analysis is important. The board directions, the board resolutions in this regard need to be passed so that the finance people can go ahead and the CSR people can guide them. All right, let's move to the next one. Now we are looking at something completely new in terms of the rules. This analysis of capital assets has always been a bit of a question mark. In the course of implementation, corporates and their partners have created capital assets, schools, hospitals, roads, rural development, whatever they have done. What happens to these assets? And this is particularly worrisome because a company is not expected to continue doing CSR forever for its whole lifetime in any one particular area. A project starts and a project ends. The very definition of project is a start date and an end date. When the project ends, what happens to the capital asset? And now for the first time, the rules answer that question head on. It tells you that now this capital asset can be transferred to, held subsequently by any one of these, a Section 8 company, registered public trust, society. Importantly here, look at the second category. Beneficiaries of the CSR project. So, SAG, self-help groups, collectives, cooperatives, entities such as that, these also can hold these assets and use them. The third category, public authority. So, this has to be a public authority under Section 2H of the RTI Act. So, things like panchayats and stuff to whom you can hand over these assets and they will ensure that they are built and managed well. You need to transfer these within 180 days of the project having been concluded. If you had done this earlier, you had created capital assets, then after this conclusion of the project, you have 180 days in which to transfer them, but that period can be extended by another 90 days by the board at its discretion. So we have a very clear picture as to what is to be done with the existing capital assets and also capital assets that you are going to create when you implement CSR projects. One simplification that has been brought in is that those companies whose budgets are below 50 lakhs, now they need not have a formal CSR committee, but the tasks of that CSR committee would now need to be undertaken by the board itself. Hence, let's say you are a company whose CSR budget or obligation is less than 50 lakhs. You don't have a CSR committee or you choose not to have one. I would still advise that you do. But if you choose not to have one, then the CSR policy has to be prepared by the board, submitted to the board, approved by the board. So the task for CSR in terms of the responsibility of the board simply enlarges. International organizations have now been given permission. Remember very clearly that they cannot act as implementing agencies. But if you feel that they are in a position to bring in international good practice into monitoring or evaluation or designing, then certainly they can be engaged as part of projects. All right, next please. So some elaboration here. The next one, CSR committee administrative overheads, it still remains the 2% law. So what do we have here? This detailed action plan. This is very, very important. The role of the CSR committee has been quite largely elaborated in these new rules. You need to read that very carefully and to ensure that this time the CSR policy lists every single program or project that the company intends to take up in the next financial year. So that project, its name, its location, its geography, and most important, its allocation, that needs to be there in the CSR policy, which goes up onto your website. So anyone else can take a look and see what are you going to execute in the coming year. Then we talk about this administrative overheads. There's a slide on that coming up separately. We'll come to that. I mentioned it to you very briefly, but that is something that the board has to be very careful about. If you go over 5%, no hassle at all. You can go up to 30%, 40%, your problem. But CSR side, you can only show 5%. company can spend other monies if it wants to. And then, of course, the old rule still applies that if you do not spend your 2% obligation, then you have to provide the reasons for not spending that amount. This is, of course, again, mandatory. All right, the next one, please. Now I'll take you again to this excess amount and surplus thing so that we are very clear. We've talked about unspent amounts, the two categories of unspent amounts. I think now you are very, very clear on what it is. Now, what is excess? Excess is that money which you may have spent beyond the 2%. So let's say your 2% obligation was 1 crore, but you ended up spending 1 crore 10. So the excess amount of spending is 10 lakhs. What can you do? Remember, this is not necessary. You may say, I've overspent, great, I'm very happy at overspending. Next year, I'll maybe exceed by an even bigger amount. Your choice. But if you want to adjust that money against the next year's budget, or the year after that, or the year after that, in short, over the next 3 years, you can set it off by reducing your budgets to that extent over the next 3 years. So this 10 lakhs, if you want to say that, okay, for the next 3 years, I'll reduce my budget by 3.33 lakhs each year, you can do so. And this is called setting off. Therefore, your excess amount can be set off against the budgets of the next 3 years if you so desire. That's with regard to excess amount, that is excess spent beyond 2%. And finally, now this is the third part of the triangle that I was talking about, surplus. What is a surplus amount? A surplus amount is that which comes out of a project. Example, you create a toilet complex. How will you maintain it? And you say, all right, this will be based on user charges. Each time a beneficiary uses that toilet, needs to pay 50 paisa, 25 paisa, 1 rupee, whatever. And over a period of 1 year, that toilet complex generates 1 lakh of rupees. This 1 lakh is the surplus amount. What can it be used for? And it says it can be used for only these 3 things. It cannot be shown as a business profit. In short, earning profit from CSR is a strict no-no. What can you do? You can plow it back into the same project. Therefore, you can use it for the upkeep of that toilet complex. You can transfer it to an unspent CSR account. Or you can use it for any other CSR activity which is there in your annual action plan. So for surplus, these 3 alternatives are available to you. What it means, I have very clearly mentioned, so I don't think you should have any doubts on that score. Let's move then to the next one. Disclosures. Now, we've had this for a while, but this sort of enunciates it with greater clarity. And for the board, this is very, very important. The board must be very clear because this is the compliance part. And that's why I've clubbed it with the responsibilities of the board also. Every member of the board of the company should literally know this slide by heart. Otherwise, you are operating at your own peril. So here we have it. The board of directors of the company must on its website talk about the composition of the CSR committee. So who are these 3 persons? By photograph, that is by name, by face, and by DI number. These 3 things should be mentioned on the website. CSR policy, as I said, vitally important. Once it's drafted, presented to the board, approved in the board by a resolution, it must go up on your website. Now, I'm mentioning all this to you because the MCA is going to look at your websites. And if these are found wanting, then I refer you to the last 2 slides of my presentation. You need to be very, very cautious from now on. And therefore, the projects, of course, in your CSR policy, those projects which have been approved by the board only can find space. So whatever are these projects which the board has approved. Now, one thing I want to mention to you here is every single project must be approved by the board and the board alone. I went into a couple of PSUs very recently and was horrified to find them telling me that, sir, we do so many projects, it becomes so hard for the board to approve each one. So we have delegated this to our general managers and we've said anything up to 50 lakhs, you guys sanction, you guys take responsibility, you guys approve and send us so that we can compile it for the board. Now that sort of reprehensible behavior will not be tolerated at all, ever. Every single project that the company does, the buck stops at the board. If anything goes wrong with that project, it's not the responsibility of the regional manager. It's just the board which can approve it and therefore take responsibility for it and also to supervise to see that the project goes well. So there you are. The projects need to be approved by the board, need to get onto your website, and therefore a lot of transparency and disclosure comes into play. The board has to also ensure, and this is the part I was talking about, it is now the responsibility of the board to ensure that administrative overheads in relation to CSR do not exceed what? 5% of the total CSR expenditure of the company. Note that the word CSR is followed by the word expenditure, not allocation, not budget. So whatever you spend in that year, your administrative overhead should not exceed 5% of the total CSR expenditure. That doesn't mean that you don't spend 6, 7, 10, 12, 30, whatever, it's up to you. But you can only show 5% of it as a CSR activity. The board needs to ensure that whatever monies and funds that are released for CSR are utilized only for CSR purposes and not for anything else. Next, the CFO comes directly in the line of fire. The projects need to be certified. Financial management has to be certified by the CFO. No CFO worth his or her salt is ever going to certify anything about which he or she has the slightest element of doubt. So CSR heads, you have to be very, 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 very careful about the accounting details, the documentation details, and all else that goes through the CFO's mind when he approves these projects. And then, of course, the board will also take decisions on what should be the duration of a project, should it be extended, and what kind of monitoring and evaluation that takes place. So the board's responsibilities for CSR are now immense, and I can assure you that any board worth its salt is going to be very, very careful about ensuring how the CSR spend happens. Next, please. So we're coming to the end, and I don't want to go too long because I would like to invite questions, but just very clearly, impact assessment, we've always wanted that there should be now outcomes rather than just outputs. And it specifies here that whereas you need not do assessment for every single project, but those companies who have a budget of 10 crores and who have undertaken projects of 1 crore or more, then in that case, impact assessment is now a must to be taken up by whom? By an independent agency. So self-certification, self-patting on the back, praising yourselves endlessly, that era is gone. What does the word independent mean? It means that that agency should have no link, none whatsoever, with any member of the organization of any shape or form. It must be completely independent. And I would advise every single corporate to quickly prepare an empanelment process and start empaneling these independent agencies so that you have them ready to start the work within a year of a project ending if its value is more than 1 crore and if your company's obligation is more than 10 crores. You need to also ensure that in your annual report, these independent reports are featured there. Lastly, I don't know why this has been said, but it has been said, the amount of money that you spend on your independent assessments should not exceed 5% of the total CSR expenditure for that financial year. So it should be kept within those limits. All right, next. I will not provide you with the pain of going through these last 2 slides. They are self-evident. Remember that they are of 2 categories, those penalties which can apply to the company and those penalties which apply to officers of the company and of course officers who sit on the board as well. And these are fairly stiff. Of course, it has been decriminalized, so there's no incarceration, but the penalties and the provisions of the penalties are fairly high. Next, please. So I've sort of classified this in an easy to read format. You can do this at your leisure. Next. Right, so I'll wind up here by saying that this is a fairly comprehensive revision of the rules. I have attempted to flesh out as much as I can, and I hope that in the course of this presentation, many of the doubts which you might otherwise have been clarified, but if not, I'm there now for you to come at me with anything where you feel you need more clarification. Over to you, Mamta.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. I think these are so many key takeaways. I mean, for me, what sticks in my mind is those 3 keywords: unspent, excess, and surplus. And I'm sure the audience sitting virtually and listening to you would have taken away a lot of very, very important points. And I think the greater responsibility on the board as well and the CFO of the organizations. So there are quite a few questions coming in, Dr. Chatterjee. I'll ask these questions to you, but if there are more, please can I encourage all of you to put in your questions in the Q&A tab that you would be able to see on your screen. So first question, Dr. Chatterjee, if I may, the question is, if my organization spends 90% of the CSR funds by March 2021, can I take another month and spend the remaining 10% instead of transferring to the special account, since the time given to transfer unspent funds in 6 months?
I'll try to give you one-word answers because they're always, if you start, fluffing, then there's a problem. The answer is no.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. That's absolutely clear. The second question that I'll pick up from the screen is the terminology used is funds dispersed. Does this mean that CSR...
Please, no. No question of disbursing, not ever. Please remove that from your minds. Capital N-O. It's a spending law. There's no disbursement. Your company disburses to your foundation. Sorry, that's not an expenditure. Your auditor will kill you. Please don't get into this.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Chatterjee. I hope, Mr. Rahul, that answers your question that you raised. The next one that we have, Dr. Chatterjee, is my company's fiscal is from Jan to December. Hence, if I have started spending in Jan, are my projects treated as ongoing, where I have to transfer to the unspent CSR account? There are multiple questions here. Or do I have to transfer to the special fund created by MCA?
Please remember, irrespective of what your company's financial year may be or may not be, you have to follow the nation's financial year. Your duration of projects would be from 1st April to 31st March. Do not disburse amounts to be spent in January and so on. If you must prepare your policy from 1st April of the coming year to 31st March of next year, irrespective of what your company's financial year may or may not be. The Ministry of Corporate Affairs is least concerned. It will analyze everything from the lens of 1st April, 31st March. So please reorient everything that you do on these terms, on this calendar.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. In fact, there are a couple of questions related to it, but I think your response that we provided now would cover that. It is a question related to long-term projects. Right? So we have committed to a long-term project for 5 years. Okay, let's say April 2017 to March 2022. If the amendment defines ongoing project as 3 years, which is excluding the year of commencement, what should we do at this point to ensure compliance? There is another question as well also. Can a 2-year program fall under the definition of ongoing project?
The second one first, and the answer is yes. As to the first one, I'll try and answer this, and I'll tell you what we should also do. It's not just about yes or no. There are very few companies who've actually taken up 5-year projects, because it sounds like the old 5-year plan of the Government of India. You never can track accurately what's happening over 5 years. Also, the rule itself is a little bit fluffy on anything that happens beyond 4 years. So my advice to you is, please advise your board to shorten that now from 5 years to 4 years if you still have time. The board has the capacity to shorten or lengthen. I would advise you to shorten the term of that project to 4 years.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. Another question. According to the amendment, what is the additional information I would need to furnish while reporting to MCA? And another question, when is the deadline to submit my CSR report?
See, now the CSR report is pretty much the same that I had designed it in a very simple 8-column format. But it's still there in the next year one. Please look at it very carefully. That information is a little bit more detailed than what you were doing for the last financial year. So I would suggest keep your antenna high, get a group of people to look at that return now, column by column. And I would strongly advise that you don't delay more than 30 days after 31st March to submit that return. If you have that data, start collecting it now. Because the expectation is that if there are unspent amounts, then you would need to deposit it within 1 month. If your return takes 3 months, how would you know what's your unspent amount? So although it doesn't say so in clear terms, the inference obviously is that you would need to try and submit it 30 days after the conclusion of the financial year.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. We spend our CSR grant through an implementation partner. If we as a company have an annual CSR spend of more than 1 crore rupees, can we treat our implementation partner as an independent agency to carry out impact assessment studies?
Please do not indulge in this criminal activity. Sorry for using a strong term. An independent agency cannot be any agency which has a conflict of interest. How would you like your child to bring home a report card written by the child himself or herself? I think it's the school report card that is important. So no way that you can ever use an implementing agency as your independent agency for impact evaluation. Don't ever do that.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. Very clear. There's another question. For long-term projects, do we have to break down the agreements with tranches and KPIs for each year?
You don't have to, but you should. I would go so far as to say you must. How will you ever monitor something which you don't have milestones? You don't have, periodic understanding of where the project is going, how far is it going right or wrong. That's the whole purpose of close monitoring. And therefore, in your MOU, which you have with your implementing agency, make sure that you have very clear timelines for each phase of the project. Divide the project into phases, monitor it closely. At the end of each milestone, get all the documentation that you need, have a quick review meeting. Wherever there are slippages, plug those holes. If there's overspending, make sure that you do it well. If the tranches have not been released in time, make sure that they are. All the correctives that you do are done at periodic reviews. Otherwise, the project will go completely haywire.
A slightly probably unrelated question to the topic that we have for the session, but it's an interesting one. Any thoughts and insights around CSR awards, maybe a sovereign awards by NCA or the Government of India?
Government of India gives the National CSR Awards. Please look out for very big advertisements that come out not only in the papers but in all social media. This year's entries have closed. In fact, I think the ceremony date, the ministry has sought a date from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister himself gives away these awards, as he did last year, at the Vigyan Bhavan. It's a very much sought after award. This year's jury has already met. It has shortlisted. The extensive visits that jury members do to the actual sites of implementation have also finished. So you can look forward to the results of this year. Many entrants whom I know of are waiting with bated breath for the results to come out. But if you are interested to join, then sometime usually around September, August, September is when MCA gives very wide publicity for entries.
Wonderful. The next question, Dr. Chatterjee, do academic institutions who are involved in impact and need assessment need to be registered?
No, but what I would say is, if an academic institution cannot implement, unless it is a registered society or a public trust, and it has 12A ATG, then it would not no longer think of itself as an academic institution. It would have to think of itself as an implementing agency, because that's what you're being hired for. And if you are being hired for implementing, then you need to have fill up CSR Form 1 and get yourself a registration number. Remember also that you can play a dual role. Let me say this. Suppose I were a corporate and I wanted to do an impact assessment of a project. Who would I empanel as an independent agency? Mostly you will find that these are academic institutions, right? Because they have the expertise to analyze, to visit, to do research. They have a lot of independent capacity. So I would say that these revisions in the rules afford a huge opportunity for academic institutions of merit and worth to play the role of independent evaluation agency. Those of you who are looking for this can also scale up, skill up, upskill, whatever you want to do, increase your bandwidth, and then if you are empaneled with good corporates, then your resources, your talents will be well employed.
Okay, thank you. This will be a straightforward answer. Implementing agencies are required to register themselves prior to the 1st of April 2021 or with effect from April 1st, 2021.
Oh, that's you answer for me.
That is a pretty straightforward one.
Prior to. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go on to the next one. The impact assessment budget should be part of the program or it should be from the overall CSR spend.
This is what was a problem earlier, but now has been categorically clarified. It is not part of 5%. It is part of the project cost. And now when you do a project, you can include the cost of documentation, survey, monitoring, evaluation. All of these are part of project costs.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of questions coming in. Doctor, sorry for firing one after the other, but very interesting to see the questions. Can an implementing organization of one company become an independent agency for another company?
Yes.
And another question related to that. Also, can an implementing partner of the company do the assessment of the other project of the company?
Repeat that a little slowly. Let me try to understand before I say yes or no.
So can an implementing partner of a company do an assessment of another company?
The implementing partner. Let's say you're the company. I am the implementing partner. All right. Now read the rest of the question. Can the implementing partner of
a company do the assessment of a project of another company?
Yes, because he's not the implementing partner of your company, right? So if it's for another company, yes, it can.
Right. Is there any specific format for the annual action plan, and what are the key parameters to be considered?
There isn't, and you could always use a consultant. But it needs to be done and needs to be done well. But what it has to include, that's been given there. But there's no format or template provided for it.
Thank you. If a pharma company gives medicines for free distribution, can it be counted as a CSR spend? And if yes, sorry?
It can do so provided it is part of a project. Example, this pharma company says that in Raigada block of Orissa, which is highly malaria infested, I would give my malaria tablets with the idea of the project to eliminate malaria in that Raigada block over a period of, let's say, 2 years. This is the project. So mere distribution will not help. You will have to, at periodic intervals, say, what else apart from tablets is required? Let's say mosquito nets. Let's say awareness. Let's say medicines. Let's say, whatever else you need to be done. So it has to be part of a much larger project. That's part one. Because now distribution, donations, one-offs, all of this is off the calendar. Has to be a proper project with a proper duration and measurement of outcomes. This is part one. Part two. If you are giving medicines as part of the project, then it's a spending law. So what was the cost of those medicines? See, transparency means just distributing free samples which you're giving to doctors who have you will have to monetize it.
So there was a second part to that question. Is at what price or cost should it be accounted?
Well, if you're giving it away free, certainly I don't expect you to charge people of remote blocks and to pay for those messes. Then whatever is your MRP or your manufacturing cost, but it must be monetized.
Thank you. We go on to the next question. Do we have to open a separate bank account for each of the ongoing projects or one account for whole of the unspent amount?
One for all the unspent amount.
Okay. Just one more.
Sure.
Sub-granting cost can be accounted as programmatic expenses, or do they fall under management expenses?
What granting cost?
Sub-granting cost.
What does sub-grant mean? Translate for me, Mamta, if you can. What is the meaning of a sub-grant?
I'm not sure, Doctor. We probably need to check with who's raised this question and maybe come back to you separately or
offline.
So if you have one, we'll take it up offline, yes. The next one is, what if you have an unspent amount of CSR related to a project for the fiscal year 1920, which was carried forward to 2021? What we answer? Should 30 days to transfer to unspent CSR account be counted from the date of notification of these rules or from the end of fiscal year 2021?
End of fiscal. The latter part is correct.
Okay. All right. I think that was the last of our questions, Dr. Chatterjee. Any closing comments, sir, before we bring the session to
It was nice to be in the hot seat, and you might call it rapid fire questions.
It was quite a rapid fire. There are a lot of questions, so I think it just reflects the value of today's session, Dr. Chatterjee.
Thank you, Mamta. It's always a pleasure. Somebody who's been in the game for so long, therefore it comes naturally to try and answer queries. I also have, I should say, the privilege and the pleasure from sitting on boards on either side. So, it's about companies and also about implementing agencies. So I see the, perspective from both sides. The questions that we ask the corporates and the questions that corporates ask the implementing agencies. If you are in that unique position, then a lot of it gets clarified.
But thank you very much for joining us today. We know you have a very, very packed schedule. I think it's a 1 hour, 15 minutes, extremely well spent, at least from my perspective. A lot of learnings and takeaways, I'm sure, for people who've joined the session. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us. And just before we close, I would like to also thank State Street India for providing us the platform for us to have this session, and to all of you for joining in. If you have any further questions, you could reach out to Rekha Srinivasan, who is the CEO for United Way of Hyderabad, and Rekha is available at rekha@unitedwayhyderabad.org. So that's a mail ID if anybody wishes to reach out to Rekha. But thanks once again for joining us. Been very important for me to say stay safe, stay healthy, and just have a wonderful rest of the evening. And thank you, Dr. Chatterjee, for joining us today.
All the very best.
Thank you.